Good morning. Hope everybody is well. We are here today to discuss Parshiyos, Acharei, Mos, and Kedoshim. The title for today's class is Elevating Above the Fray. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the expression staying above the fray, which means staying above the normal muck, the normal fighting, the normal deficiencies that occur in given situations, and staying above the fray means being above it and not negatively affected by it. So we're calling today's class Elevating Above the Fray. This month, which is the month of Iyar, is sponsored by the Slomiansky family in loving memory of Daniel Ben Yaakov Levi Yitzchok Isaac. Baruch Hashem, we've been doing this for several years, and the Slomiansky family, for those of you that are privileged to know them, are stalwart and critical and wonderful members of our South Florida community. They have a Shem Tov, and we are honored to be partnering with them, and we certainly wish them ongoing, continued, and even more nechama for that huge loss that they experienced many years ago. So the neshama of Daniel Ben Yaakov should have an aliyah. Our learning should be a credit for him, and Be'ezras Hashem, thereby for K'lal Yisrael, he will also have a tremendous zechus. This week's class is also sponsored in memory of all of the fallen soldiers and victims in Am Yisrael, and for the return of the hostages. As things are ramping up in Gaza, we definitely need to be continuing in renewed vigor and more frequently for the safety of all of our soldiers and for all of our people. This week's class is also dedicated to all members of K'lal Yisrael suffering pain and hardships, and for the merit of a Refu'ah Sh'leima for Yisroel Ben Rochel, Meir ben Ruth, Chaim Yitzchak ben Chaya B'racha, Yidel Ben Rochel, Moshe David Ben Rochel, dear friend who's having surgery today, Sonayela Basya, Yehudis Rus, also very dear friends of our family, and Levi Yitzchok Isaac ben Orah Yutel. All of these people should have a Refu'ah Sh'leima B'karov. And of course, among all K'lal Yisrael, who also should experience a Refu'ah Sh'leima B'karov. I think we would probably all agree to the following observation. Due to technology advances, as well as a new paradigm of globalization that has now been developing over the last 50 plus years, humanity has tremendously benefited from the sharing of knowledge and physical resources. Everything from food from different countries, fruits out of season in one country available in other seasons, medical information, developing vaccines in one country for another country, huge benefits that have been shared across the globe. The flip side of this same ecosystem is that humanity is also sharing negative ideologies, as well as exploiting others' weaknesses and not only sharing their strengths. A very practical and huge problem that has emerged are global monopolies of various types and various businesses. And in addition to that, people's obsession with earning massive amounts of money and often thinking that major earnings ought to happen without much effort at all. Right? This is kind of the illusion of social media and many things that people have access to. Press a button and suddenly there's a fantasy world that appears, and that person did it, why can't I do it? All this type of thinking has a very negative effect on the way people perceive themselves and the world, and then what they decide to pursue. An additional major problem is the mental health dysfunction that has grown ubiquitous, with a minimum of 20% of the global population suffering from either anxiety or depression or addiction to drugs or alcohol. So I've spoken about that in the past. Look it up if you don't believe me. It's bad, and most people think it's much worse than the numbers actually represent. This does not even reflect other forms of serious addictions that people may have and other illnesses. In a nutshell, there exists a tremendous amount and variety of global ailments, right? Things that are maladies, physical or ideological or mental. And lastly, I contend that due to technology, almost all of us, and literally almost all of us, become distracted and anxious because we are bombarded by these troublesome realities, either because we click the wrong button, we read the wrong article, and we actively engage in thinking about these things and finding out about them, or because other people, our friends, our family, or others, drag us into these awarenesses. Hey, did you hear about, right? That's like how many conversations begin. And so we become kind of assaulted by all of this information, much of which is not helpful to our state of mind or practically beneficial in our lives. So I think we could probably all agree to those observations. Now, interestingly, there have been studies, well documented, where small sections of our globe have seemingly created pockets of extremely healthy living. These communities have been dubbed blue zones. I hereby thank my wife, Sarah, for introducing me to the concept of blue zones several years ago. So here's a brief overview of blue zones. Blue zones are regions worldwide where people consistently live longer, healthier lives than average, often reaching or exceeding 100 years old as a kind of a norm. These areas are characterized by unique lifestyles, diets, and social structures that contribute to longevity. Now, it's not only longevity, it contributes to a number of other things, but that's what this article says. And currently, the 5 original blue zones are Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Loma Linda, California, Icaria, Greece, and Nicoya, Costa Rica. So small amounts spread over, widely different regions in the globe, and nonetheless, they exist as kind of healthy communal pockets. Key characteristics of blue zones are healthy diet, and it's usually a predominantly plant-based diet emphasizing fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. Regular physical activity, incorporating movement throughout the day, often related to work or daily life. Strong social connections with an emphasis on community, family, and close-knit relationships. Sense of purpose, having a clear direction and meaning in life. And stress management, techniques like mindfulness, meditation, and relaxation to reduce stress levels. So in these different communities, for example, in Okinawa, Japan, it's known for its long-lived women and a strong sense of community through groups that are called moai, which means lifelong friendship groups. In Sardinia, Italy, it's home to the world's longest-lived men, with a strong focus on traditional mountain farming, moderate alcohol consumption, especially red wine, and a sense of ikagi, which is apparently a reason for being. In Loma Linda, California, a Seventh-day Adventist community with a high concentration of centenarians, often attributed to the vegetarian diet, strong faith, and active lifestyles. In Greece, in Icaria, a Greek island with a low incidence of chronic diseases and a healthy plant-based diet. And Nicoya, a region with a high proportion of people reaching their 90s and beyond, emphasizing family, faith, and work with a strong sense of purpose. So it's fascinating that as tiny and as small numbered these communities are, they do exist, and they're called blue zones, and that's what I'm bringing up today. So I suggest that in Parshiyos, Acharei, Mos, and Kedoshim, the Torah is here presenting us with the formula that is the antidote both to becoming negatively affected by the dysfunctional ecosystem of our globe, as well as the formula for creating a healthy and happy environment in our Jewish communities. In other words, this is Hashem teaching us how to develop Torah blue zones. So the overview of our Parsha, which is important to understand, Parshas Acharei Mos begins with close to 35 sentences on the Yom Kippur service. Everything that the Kohen Gadol does on Yom Kippur Day, bringing offerings representing himself, other Kohanim, and the Jewish people, and the fact that Yom Kippur is the day which we hopefully gain atonement and purity in front of Hashem. Then the Torah immediately digresses to a discussion about shechting animals, and that animals need to be shechted. They need to be slaughtered in the Mishkan precincts or the Beis HaMikdash precincts. Now, it's an argument in the Talmud if this refers to only karbanos or refers to regular animals. We're going to get into that argument shortly, so leave that to the side. And that anybody who does not slaughter the animal in the right place is liable to a death penalty of excision. Then the Torah goes to a conversation about eating blood, other mitzvahs related to eating blood of an animal, and the prohibition and the fact that blood is considered to be the soul, and that also the punishment for eating blood improperly, the improper types of blood, the punishment for that is also excision, also a form of the death penalty. Immediately after that, we then have the portion of Acharei that we read every Yom Kippur afternoon, which talks about not following the ways of depraved societies. Don't be like the Canaanites, don't be like the Egyptians, and staying away from all immoral relationships, the sexual immorality laws, including not with animals and other things. And then Torah concludes Acharei by telling us all of these depravities are what the Gentiles of Israel did before the Jewish people inherited the land. And if you don't want Eretz Yisrael to spit you out, then make sure that you observe these laws and stay away from doing those behaviors. Parshas Kedoshim, the second parsha that we'll be reading the Shabbos, talks about how we have to be holy like Hashem, and then it talks about many of the fundamentals of the Torah, having proper awe for our parents, not doing idolatry, making sure we know the existence of Hashem, certain laws of the sacrifices, other very important societal laws, including gifts to the poor and not stealing, and making sure we don't show favoritism in pursuit of administering judgment, right? We shouldn't favor a poor person or a rich person over the other, giving rebuke, loving your neighbor like yourself. And then the Torah talks about certain laws of Eretz Yisrael, about the new fruits. And then the Torah concludes with not having false weights and measures. And then the Torah talks about punishments for all the improper sexual relationships. And again, the Torah concludes with saying, be holy to me. I separated you from the other nations to be mine. And we shouldn't follow in their idolatrous or witchcraft manners. Okay, so the questions that we're going to ask are, how do we kind of coalesce all this information into a theme that makes sense? And we'll get to that shortly. But before we go into the specific questions, here's a little bit of background, a fascinating teaching. It's brought in Tractate Chulin 16b and 17a. It's also brought in the Midrash, and Rashi does a lot of quoting of these passages in the Talmud and in the Midrash. And basically the subject is, when the Jewish people were in the desert, after leaving Egypt, before they got to Eretz Yisrael, if you don't mind, just give me one moment. When the Jewish people left Egypt and were living in the desert, the question is, were the Jewish people living in the desert allowed to eat meat? Were they allowed to eat the meat of animals? They had their own animals, or if they purchased animals, were they allowed to kill the animals and eat the meat? So the Talmud brings two opinions of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud. One of them is named Rabbi Yishmael, and the other one is named Rabbi Akiva. Now, according to Rabbi Yishmael, which is the main one that we're going to focus on today, although we will mention Rabbi Akiva's opinion in a moment, according to Rabbi Yishmael, when the Jews were in the desert, they were not allowed to eat any meat from animals, even kosher animals, unless it was first an offering, meaning it was sanctified to be brought to Hashem as an offering, and that portions of that animal were then permitted to be eaten by the Jews and not only the Kohanim. That's the only meat that the Jewish people were allowed to eat in the desert before they entered Eretz Yisrael. And this is based on sentences here in our Parsha and based on sentences in Deuteronomy, in Parshas Fray. And Rabbi Yishmael continues, when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael, then they were, yes, allowed to eat animals that were not sacrificed as kosher animals, whether the cows and bulls and sheep and goats, etc. They would be allowed to eat them even if they were not sacrifices. Okay, that's Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. Rabbi Akiva says differently. He says, no, the Jewish people in the desert were, yes, allowed to eat meat that was not from a sacrifice. They could eat regular, so to speak, mundane kosher animals, a cow, a bull, a sheep, and a goat. But when it came to sacrificial animals, those need to be properly slaughtered, whereas regular animals, while they were in the desert, they did not need proper slaughtering. They could even be improperly slaughtered so that it wasn't a smooth cut, so to speak. It would still be permitted. But in Eretz Yisrael, once the Jews reached Eretz Yisrael, then they were only allowed to eat properly slaughtered meat, whether they be non-sacrificial animals, meaning mundane animals, or animals that were of sacrifices. Okay, that's the argument. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background to the questions that we're going to ask. So question number one is that immediately following the description of the Yom Kippur service, the Torah digresses to discussing the laws of slaughtering animals, and only doing so in the environs of the Mishkan, eventually of the Beis Hamikdash, the temple. Why are these two sections next to each other? It seems quite random indeed. We're talking about the very special, specific services of Yom Kippur, when all the Jewish people receive atonement. And then we go to a seemingly almost disconnected idea. By the way, the Jewish people are not allowed to eat, according to Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, they're not allowed to eat any meat unless it's a sacrifice. And if they, God forbid, would eat meat that's not a sacrifice, or eat from a sacrifice that's not brought in the temple environs, it's a capital crime punishable by Acharei, by excision. What does one thing have to do with the other? Why are these two concepts juxtaposed? Number two is that when we look at the remainder of Acharei, and we're pointing out today even the remainder of Kedoshin, it deals with other prohibitions and requirements relating to animal blood and not following the depraved ways of wicked cultures and refraining from immoral relationships. And then, as I mentioned, Parshas Kedoshim has many other laws of the fundamentals of the Torah, finishing with punishments for immoral relationships. Why is all of this discussed just after the Yom Kippur service and slaughtering animals in the temple or the Mishkan precincts? Well, what is all of this? What's the flow of these sections as pertains to Yom Kippur, or this interesting law about were they allowed to eat mundane animals in the desert, and you have to bring sacrificial animals to the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan? What is all of this? How does it all flow together? And then finally, as the argument that we mentioned, according to the Talmudic opinion, which, as I said, is based on verses here and in Sefer Devarim and Parshas Re'eh, that in the 40 years that the Jews were sojourning in the desert, they were only allowed to eat meat from sacrifices, but not regular mundane animals. Why was this the case? And why did it then become permitted in Eretz Yisrael? So those are our three questions. How do we connect Yom Kippur to this law of slaughtering animals, where you slaughter them mundane or holy? Why is the rest of the Parsha here and in Kedoshin dealing with not following in the ways of the Goyim or other blood-related laws, or the fact that we need to have all the fundamentals of the Torah taught to us again, and then the punishment for the immoral relationships? How does it all flow together? And then finally, why would it be the case that in the Midbar, the Jewish people were only allowed to eat meat from sacrifices, as per Rabbi Yishmael, but when they get to Eretz Yisrael, now they're allowed to eat meat from regular animals? So I'd like to begin with, I think, a very related Torah thought, and try to explain that, and then come back and explain this as well. One of the major shifts that we see in the book of Bereshis, from when man was first created to after the flood, when Noach leaves the ark, is that all opinions hold that first man, meaning Adam Harishon, until Noach, meaning until Noach after the flood, first man was not allowed to kill an animal and eat it. There's a question if an animal died on its own, if he could eat it, but everybody agrees that he was not allowed to kill an animal and eat it. He could only eat vegan. Once Noach and the flood happened, Hashem very explicitly, after the flood, gives man permission to eat meat, just like he gave man permission to eat the vegetation of the field, vegetables and fruits, etc. Why did that shift take place? Why is that the case? And my simple answer is that man was destined to live forever, And even after the original sin, when he was cursed to not live forever, man could have regained his position of what happened before the Garden of Eden, even though there were angels protecting that man shouldn't go back there. Had man transformed himself properly, had Cain and Hevel done differently, had man not then started pursuing various forms of idolatry and ultimately immorality and robbing, man could have regained entry into the Garden of Eden, I would contend. I would say even after the flood, Noah thought maybe that was possible, subject for a different time. But the point is that when man understands innately that a huge component of him is his soul and his inclination towards the spiritual, then man learns that that ought to be his main focus. And when that ought to be man's main focus, he really should not be engaging in the pursuit of that which is most physical, that which is most animalistic. That should not be man's pursuit. So just to digress a moment to Dr. Horowitz's question, it is not brought down that I know of anywhere in, so to speak, the original sources, although it might be. I contend that that's true because of the way that the Torah phrases it, that that Hashem set up those angels to guard the path of the Eitz Chaim. It sounds like there is a path, and there could be access to that path, but for the time being, the angels are there to block it. And so I would logically suppose that if man overcomes his sin that got him kicked out, that then he could find his way back. Now, there are other allusions to that we could talk about another time, but that's where I'm coming from. So the point is that this law also kind of indicates that man is still not supposed to seek as his food animal meat until the flood happens, where man definitely downgrades his level of lifespan and his level of spirituality. And then at that point, it would be possible for man to be more animalistic. And even though you could argue, well, then he should for sure pursue that which is spiritual, on the other hand, there was a major capitulation to a lesser kind of man. And what ultimately happens is that then you have Avraham Avinu and his descendants who start to engage on the original plan of what man is supposed to become, and they enter covenantal relationships with Hashem, and then ultimately we stand in Mount Sinai and accept the Torah to be in pursuit of that. And that's what I'm suggesting is what we're talking about here. Now that the Jewish people have retaken the mantle of what is supposed to be man's focus and pursuit in this world, according to Rabbi Yishmael, Hashem says, while you are in the desert, now we have to concentrate on pursuing the highest level of man's existence. And you can, yes, eat meat, but only if it's part of a spiritual pursuit called a sacrifice, an offering. And while the Jews were in the desert, that was the law. The only meat that they were allowed to kill and eat was an animal that's brought as a sacrifice. Now, it's beautiful the way the actual words in the Torah are said. And not to be too, kind of tedious, but technical, but the Torah does imply that it's all meat that would be this way, which is what Rabbi Yishmael says. And so much so that if, God forbid, a person does kill an animal that is not a sacrifice in order to eat its flesh, it's almost like murder. It's a capital crime. It is such a negative pursuit that it's considered to be like killing a person. That's how heinous, so to speak, the crime is. And so therefore, I suggest that what the Torah is telling us here is an incredible insight, and it does, yes, apply to our lives. If we understand that the focus of a Jew is to cultivate the most intimate relationship that he can possibly have with Hashem, like Yom Kippur represents, the Day of Atonement, where we fix ourselves, we transform ourselves, and we elevate ourselves to the highest level of connection that we can, which is in the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, the Kohen Gadol represents all the Jews, and we achieve that intimacy connection. If that's our pursuit, then we should really be able to make all of our physical endeavors and pursuits holy, because it's all in service to Hashem, and we should carefully refrain from engaging in that which is mundane, that which is not in a direct pursuit and heavily focused on spirituality. And that would be a capital crime. And that's what the Torah is telling us here, for sure, according to Rabbi Yishmael, which is how Nachmanides, for example, learns all these sentences. He says that's the more simple explanation of these sentences. Okay, so then the Torah tells us that if we are paying attention properly, what the Torah is telling us is, if we understand that Sefer Vayikra is leading us to this place where we as Jews get to experience the Holy of Holies through the service of the Kohen Gadol, and we get to this kind of intimacy moment with Hashem, where we then are truly, truly elevated, so then we're able to approach the physical world correctly, and then we will be able to, yes, eat from meat of animals, but only if it's part of a spiritual pursuit. And the Torah tells us that it's a very attractive thing to be physical, to eat meat. My father always says, there's a reason why people love eating meat. It feels like a mastery over nature. It feels like a power. And it is very attractive. And even eating blood, there's an attraction that some people have for that, even though many of us don't find it appealing. But the idea of eating the lifeblood of something has this attraction, because it allows us to engage in the animalistic side of ourselves. And the Torah is telling us to be very, very careful how we deal with animals and our interest in them and the blood of them. And then the Torah immediately explains to us that you need to understand that many of the wicked societies of our world do heavily engage in these physical pursuits, and they become incredibly depraved and immoral. The most wicked of them, that's the way the rabbis learned, were the Canaanites and the Egyptians, and we have to be very, very careful to not imitate their behaviors. But the Torah is telling us something so clever here. We might think that it means, okay, don't do the immorality that they do. Don't engage in these improper sexual escapades or relationships. No, that's not real. That's true. And we have to be careful of all of that. But really, the way the Torah phrases everything is to not come close to that. Stay far away from that. And the way that you stay far away from that is not only doing those activities, but don't do the things that these societies do that get them into the mindset of the physical pursuit, that gets them into the ways of thinking that makes them want to be more animalistic. All you need to do is watch some sports teams and the way they behave after they score. They celebrate like animals. That's the way that they are feeling good about themselves. And so over here we have this law that's called Darkei HaEmori, the ways of the Amorites, the people of Canaan, or Uv'chukosehem lo seilechu, don't follow their cultures, whether it's their theaters or their circuses. You need to understand that if you are going to fall into the mindset of being interested in the way these societies behave outside of the specific prohibitions of the negative, immoral conduct that they have, even outside of that, the other pursuits, then what happens is you become attracted away from pursuing Yom Kippur. You become attracted away from pursuing using the physical world as a means of connecting to Hashem. And you instead become part of the fray. You become part of the ecosystem of the world where everybody wants to know, hey, did you hear what the latest thing they said about Trump? Or did you hear the latest thing that they said about this guy who was fired? I don't know how many articles have been written on Peter Hegseth using, whatever he used to discuss, sensitive information. Really matters to us. This is what the world is involved in. And if we're going to allow ourselves to be captured by what the vast population of the world is thinking about, we are going to get attracted to the same things that they become attracted to. And so this is the Torah's way of telling us the formula for staying above the fray and beginning to create healthy Torah blue zones. So why is it that immediately following the description of the Yom Kippur service, the Torah digresses to discussing the laws of slaughtering animals and only doing so in the Beis HaMikdash? Because the most basic thing that people pursue is eating delicious food. That is the most basic thing that all people pursue. And the most common denominator of all those healthy blue zones that we began our conversation with today is being careful about what they eat. It's just a fact. And so the Torah is telling you, if you don't want to become part of that unhealthy development of societies that degenerate into literally depraved and immoral societies, you need to be very careful that that which you eat is not a pursuit of gluttony and self-gratification, but it's also a way of coming close to Hashem, especially in the arena of meat. And then the Torah continues. In addition to that, you need to be careful not to follow in the ways, the negative ways of society. Now, here's a beautiful point that was shared with me today by Joseph Rackman, and we actually spoke about this idea this past Friday, but he's right that it applies here as well, and it's very much in the Psukim as well. In order to be successful at this, it's huge, very, very important, and I have a lot of work to do in this area. In order to be successful, to be careful in our pursuit of spirituality versus physicality, we need the community to support us in this pursuit, and we need to cultivate a community around us that will help us in this pursuit. So just last week, we mentioned how most people, the Torah is telling us, are not going to the Kohen on their own when they have tzara'as, when they realize they have this biblical form of leprosy that's a message to Hashem. They are brought by other people to the Kohen, because a community that cares about the spiritual development of their members, that's a Torah-based community. And people need that communal help to maintain their physical and spiritual good health and pursuing things the correct way. People need community for that. Just like Yom Kippur is experienced as a community. The Kohen Gadol does the service for everyone. Everyone is standing around davening for the success of the Kohen Gadol. It's a communal effort of connection to Hashem, and the community has to support each other in that pursuit. And therefore, the Torah is telling us that we need to encourage each other. We need to create a space where it's good where people feel good to be in pursuit of spiritual things or using physical things for spiritual things. All of that is also a communal approach. And then the Torah is telling us, unfortunately, if you don't create this healthy Torah blue zone, the natural momentum is towards the most depraved societies of our generation. And so therefore the Torah specifically admonishes the Jewish people of the desert, don't become like the Egyptians that you left and that society which was attractive to you. Don't become like the Canaanite society that you are now entering, because that will be attractive to you. Don't become that way. And there are so many examples that we could use, so many examples. Let's take just one, which is social media and the use of technology. Most people think that it's somehow not normal to be disconnected. But on the other hand, so many people have come to realize that it's so much healthier to have great boundaries around the usage of these technologies. It's so much healthier to put down one's phone and to have family dinner at the table. It's so much healthier to think about really limiting whatever interaction that you have with the news and the entertainments that are on these devices. It's so much healthier. but many people in society would think you're not normal if you do that, right? So that's the exact point. In order for us to maintain a sense of discernment and be able to make a choice that is healthy and how to use the meat for a spiritual pursuit, like the Torah is recommending, we have to have a blue zone of safety. And according to Rabbi Yishmael, something incredible emerges. In the desert, while the Jewish people were not yet settled in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yishmael says they were not allowed to eat any meat that was not from a sacrifice. But once they enter Eretz Yisrael and we're living the Torah in its ideal state, then we can, yes, engage in the eating of meat that is mundane, because the whole society is safe. That's a place where we can even have mundane meat and we will not be led astray and become part of the depraved societies and what I'm loosely calling today the Fray. But if we build those safe communities, we are much better protected even to engage in, quote unquote, the things that other societies are engaged in, and will make much healthier choices around them, and we will not get distracted or taken out of our focus of spirituality because we have a safe environment in which to engage. And I think that's a huge benefit for those of us who understand how today we need to build community of relationships with people that are encouraging us to learn Torah, that are encouraging us to improve ourselves as human beings, to be more introspective, that are encouraging us to pursue better marriages and relationships, right? So much of the world has kind of relegated themselves to this is just the way it is, and then unfortunately become incredibly unhealthy in so many ways. The Torah is literally telling us how to build a formula away from that. And that's an incredible thing. If you look back at that list that I was sharing about, these different communities, so often what they have is, in addition to their focus on what they're eating, is a strong faith, a purpose, a reason for living, an appreciation of community. All of this is an incredible formula that the Torah already gives us. And for Jews, we get to do this anywhere because we build a community around the shul. We build a community around where people interact with each other that are properly focusing on the correct values. But we need to do much better to emphasize the good health that the Torah is offering us. We need to get our entertainments not from what society is teaching us should occupy our minds, but rather what the Torah is teaching us should occupy our minds. We need to get focused on a spiritual pursuit of cultivating better and better and better communication with Hashem and our closest relationships, like the Torah tells us to do. And then I do strongly believe that we will not only become healthier spiritually, we will become healthier physically. And not only will we become healthier spiritually and physically, but because Jews are so naturally impactful in the world, we will hopefully expand the actual blue zones of the world to many, 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 many more communities. And it does, mean that we need to be much more discerning about what we eat, why we eat, how we eat, the quantities that we eat, etc. We need to become much more discerning of what our obsession is in life. Is it money or is it purpose? We need to become much more mindful of how are we treating the people that are closest to us in our lives? Are we really supporting them and creating spaces of safety for them, both spiritually and physically? We need to be aware of all of that because that's what the Torah is advocating in terms of building Torah blue zones. Questions or comments for today?
See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Kiva, Abba's saying this year, okay?
Great. Okay, yes. Everybody, please zoom over.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yitzchak. So great to see you. Yes, Dr. Horowitz.
Yeah, it seems that the formula for the blue zones for a long life are very much like the formula for happiness.
Definitely. That's why I said at the beginning that this will lead to very happy living.
There
Absolutely.
must be some divergent point where it goes from happy living to long living. Although there seem to be also within the Jewish community an unusual amount of older people. But maybe that's just my perspective. Being
No, I think that is correct. I think there's specifically a study, I just didn't look it up for today. There's specifically a study about Ashkenazi Jews that are centenarians. They seem to have a significant success in that arena. But I think you're right. There should be a bigger correlation in Torah societies as well. We certainly know that in other ways, the Torah societies tend to be a lot more healthy, such as in a lower divorce rate and other things like that. But it, it needs to be much better than it is.
And I've seen things that they say that Israel is one of the happiest countries in the world, despite all the tax.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Of course, we even there we need it to be much improved, right? There could be so much that could be improved. Yeah, that's correct. Thank you for adding that. Anybody else for today? All right, so I wish everybody a great week.